Oh, hello, Amos. Welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us all the way from Tucson, Arizona to Manchester in the UK.
Thank you, David. It's good to get this call.
Right, so I'd like to start with some background about you, and we'll lead on to what your current situation is and the book. But I see from your blog that for the first, was it 10 years of your life you lived overseas because of your father? He was in the diplomat. Is that correct?
Yes, he was a Foreign Service diplomat. Yeah.
Right. And did you have an established religious life there? Did your mother and father follow a religious path?
Well, interestingly, my mother had never met anybody Christian who she really thought lived the teachings, and so she wasn't impressed. So subsequently, she never identified as a Christian. But then when we were living in Indonesia, in Jakarta actually, she met a holy man in the Himalayas who's named Durrani Sahib. And Durrani Sahib, of all people, encouraged her to read the Gospels. And she said, and Durrani Sahib said, if you read these Gospels, I think you really resonate with them. And so he had some intuition into her character because she did read the Gospels. And it was at that moment, somewhere, I think in the middle of the Gospel of Mark, where she realized for herself, she said, if God was to come in human form, this is what God would look like. And so it was shortly after that we were baptized, my sister and I, and my dad, and we became formally Christians in Jakarta, Indonesia.
Right. Was that in the Episcopalian Church or a particular?
Yes, we started out Episcopalian, and that's where I went throughout my high school years up until I was 18. I was an Episcopalian. Yeah.
Okay. For those that may be unfamiliar with the description, I think different countries have different ways of saying the same thing. But how would you describe the Episcopalian Church as compared to, say, is it like Church of England or a denomination of the Church of England?
Well, the Episcopal Church, as far as I know, is the Anglican Church.
Yeah.
It's called the Anglican Church in East Africa. I attended, when I was living in Uganda in East Africa, I attended All Saints Cathedral, which is an Anglican church. And the Episcopalian Church, I think, is synonymous with the Anglican Church. I might be mistaken.
Yeah.
But I think it is the Church of England, whether you call it Anglican or Episcopal.
Okay, that's fine. And you earned a bachelor's degree in comparative religion and a master's of divinity from Berkeley and a doctor of ministry from Chicago Theological Seminary. So you've obviously devoted a large part of your life to this work. Was that like a natural progression from how you started your early life? Did it develop, or did it just happen, or was it planned? To what extent was it planned, if that's the case?
Well, that's a good question, David, because I think honestly it wasn't really planned. I always had an interest in religion. I loved reading. I remember the first author who I really loved reading was Henry Nouwen. I read his book on, I think it was called Desert Solitude, and from there I just started reading all of his books, and I just had a real interest in spirituality, and so that is why I chose comparative religion when I went to college. But then after college, I really wasn't sure if I wanted to teach comparative religion at the college level, or if I wanted to become a minister. So to figure it out, I went to northern India, to Uttar Pradesh, to this school. It's called the Landau Language School in Missouri, India. And I studied Hindi and Sanskrit. And after about 3 months of Hindi and Sanskrit, I realized it's not for me. Kind of trial and error there, I guess. It's very, very complicated, very difficult language. I think you have to have a real deep aptitude for languages to learn those languages. So anyway, at that point, I decided I was going to move on. And then, long story short is, through a number of unplanned turns in the road, I decided that I wanted to become a Christian minister and that I should go to seminary.
Right. And also, in your college days, you became a member of the Quakers. Can you
Yes.
explain what happened there and how that has progressed since then?
Well, see, there's another coincidental turn in the road. When I was in high school, I loved my summer camp. It was called St. George's Summer Camp, and it was in the Shenandoah Mountains.
Mm.
And I loved all the people who worked there, and they'd been working there for some of them 40 years. And so there was an Episcopalian bishop. I remember his name actually. His name was Bishop Lee, and he came into the diocese of Virginia. And for some reason, and I don't know all the details, but for some reason he went into this this summer camp, St. George's Camp, and he fired everybody outright. And I remember my dad's comment that the last vestige of the divine right of kings is the Episcopalian bishop. And so I was very turned off by that because I love those people, and Bishop Lee just came in, he fired all the people outright, he put in his own people. And it was at that point in my life, I was only 18, but I thought, I don't like this high church stuff. I don't like being bullied by a bishop. So I decided I wanted to go into a more low church, what I would call grassroots kind of a faith, and that's what attracted me to the Quakers. Is they have no ministers, they have no bishops. It's really the opposite extreme. And so I was a Quaker for 5 years when I was in Santa Cruz. I was a member of the Religious Society of Friends in Santa Cruz, California.
Right. Obviously, as you know, with American history, the Quakers go so way back, and some of the first settlers, they were escaping from, was it religious persecution in the UK?
Oh, yes.
Oh,
yes. Well, and the Quakers are really extraordinary when you think of how much they've been able to accomplish with such relatively small numbers. The Quakers were the first organization in the United States to officially come out against slavery, to officially denounce slavery. They were the first. The Unitarians then followed, and then I think the Congregational Church followed that. But they were always on the forefront of social justice. And I was also impressed with the prison reforms they were able to accomplish in England.
Yeah.
The conditions for the prisoners were terrible in those times of George Fox, with rats and all kinds, just no rights for the prisoner. And the Quakers really transformed the prisons in England with very small numbers. It was really incredible.
Yeah, that's right. It's they obviously have a very close commitment to, as you say, social justice and social reform. Do you still keep in contact? Do you still have a strong feeling that they had before about the Quakers, or is that just one of the aspects of your life in the sort of in the religious?
No, I tell people I'm a closet Quaker. I might be a minister in the United Church of Christ, but when it comes to my inmost heart, I think that's where I still am. I mean, that's where I still identify. The silent meetings for worship, the understanding that that all of the elders of the meeting have a profound collective wisdom, and the commitment to social justice and to nonviolence, and that nonviolence is not just one derivative of the gospel, but it's central to the gospel. I think that's still at the very heart of my identity and who I am. Yeah.
Right. So, how would you describe the United Church of Christ to those who may not be familiar with that term? You've joined them. You began your career, I think, 1999, was it, in Montana?
Yes. Well, I had joined before that, but I first became a minister I was first ordained in 1999 in Montana. But the United Church of Christ is the oldest Christian denomination in the United States. They were originally called the Puritans, and I'm sure you're familiar with that name.
Yes.
But then as time went on, something very interesting happened with the Puritans. It was this profound phenomenon that is really not written about that much in history books. But the Puritans always valued education, and so they were constantly reading and keeping their minds open. And as more and more different kinds of people came into the New World, into New England, all kinds of different types of people, they started to realize that maybe God's vision is much larger than they originally anticipated. And so they began to open their minds themselves. and they established some of the most reputable colleges in the United States. Harvard College was founded by the Congregationalists,
Yeah.
who were what the Puritans were then called after a while. And some of the other colleges, well-respected colleges in New England, Dartmouth and a whole number of colleges were founded by the Congregational Church. But then another thing happened, which is they started to become much more inclusive. So the first woman ever ordained in the United States, Antoinette Brown, was a Congregationalist minister. The first black man ever ordained in the United States, his name was Lemuel Haynes. He was a Congregational minister. And then I think second or third to the Quakers and the Unitarians, the Congregationalists were the first formal denomination in the United States that was formally Christian, aside from those two, to denounce slavery. And so they've had a number of firsts, and they've always been on the forefront of social justice, and that's always impressed me. So that's why I became a United Church of Christ minister.
Right. So you discussed in your blog about Christianity needing a deep change, and we will lead up to your book very soon. But is that something that has been with you for a long time, or just developed more strongly now to propel you towards doing what you do now in the book and the things that you are closely involved in? It's something that I can relate to because of my background in the church in England, and the fact of an us and a them, and that certainly was the case in my very early religious life. Up to being 17, there was sort of a us saved and the sinners and that sort of thing, which I found difficult to relate to, and I did move away from the church. Was that a similar situation with you? You went along with some things and then you questioned more and then developed towards where you are now? That's
Yes, and you know, I like what you said, David. I think that's what how a lot of people experience the church as an us and a them kind of phenomenon. And I heard one fellow who is part of an AA meeting that meets at our church. He said, you know, the modern day Pharisees are churchgoers. You know, they're the ones who kind of, you know, look their nose down at everyone else. And that's very unfortunate. And I think that's why I finally landed in the United Church of Christ, because it is so inclusive. Yeah. It's also inclusive of gay and lesbian people. Yeah. And one of the phrases that's always said in my church, and it's said before communion, is that whoever you are and wherever you are on life's journey, you're welcome here. Yeah. And for me, that's more honest and more in line with the gospel. Because in my estimation, the four most radical words probably in the gospel is he touched the leper. Yes. You know, in Jesus' time, no one even looked at a leper, much less considered touching one. I mean, when a leper came around, people would pelt him with stones. Yeah. And so for Jesus to touch the leper shows to the extent to which he reached out to all people who were on the margins. And I really believe that that's the core of the gospel message. Mm-hmm. And when we lose that, we lose the gospel. And I think we become churchianity, and we're no longer Christianity, but churchianity, which is unfortunate.
That's right. It's not always what church you belong to, but what you do as a person, the person you are.
Yes.
Is very important, and obviously Jesus was the supreme example that no one is excluded, and anyone that does exclude, it's not authentic, in my opinion.
Yes. Well, and I would even take it a step further. It's not only that we tend to exclude people who are on the margins of society, and in the United States, you know, we like to put our old people in nursing homes. We like to put our prisoners in prisons, mentally ill in mental hospitals, and people don't like to visit those places, and they just stay on the outskirts of society. Nobody wants to go to the Alzheimer's unit. And so we live in this society where the white picket fence in the front of people's yards is a fence that's beyond just that picket. It's a fence in our minds where there's certain areas of our society where we don't want to go. And so I do think it requires a change of heart to see all human beings in a different way as made in God's image and as having profound worth. And then I think that also extends to not only do we accept people on the margins of society, But those aspects of ourselves that we like to hide and suppress and deny about ourselves, and that we don't want anybody to know about, we allow those aspects of ourselves to come to light, and we start to accept and have a greater degree of honesty with our own selves. That, hey, if we look deeply within us, we've got this stuff from our family of origin. We've got these issues, and being a minister for 15 years, I mean, that's one of the huge wake-up calls I've had, which is, I don't know of a single family that it's not neurotic, David.
Yes.
I mean, come on, let's be honest about it. I mean, there's some who are more than others, but this is the human condition, and all families have their issues and their challenges and their neuroses. So that to me is an honest reading of the gospel on an exterior level and an interior level.
Also, the many sayings of Jesus are things that really motivate us to live the way we do. And one, he who is without sin cast the first stone.
Yes.
And one of my favourites, even the least among you can do as I have done. And he was quite a radical at the time, and he really rocked the boat big time.
Right. Well, and that radical nature of the gospel is lost on us because it's been dulled by too much repetition, and so the good news becomes the old news, unfortunately. But really, when you unpack the radical nature of it, it is still good news, and it's transformative news, and it's powerful news.
Right. So, one of the central pillars of your book, you talk about the Alexandrian mystics and the Jesus paradox. They're just two at the moment. Could you talk about those and give us your understanding and how they motivated you to do what you've done in writing the book?
Well, I've always been drawn to Christian mysticism, but my lament with Christian mysticism is that it tends to talk about this mystic over there who lived in a vacuum, and that mystic over there who it just somehow appeared in that province at that particular time, and there's this diffuse nature of it where it doesn't seem to have any kind of cohesive central point, and so I really searched for that. I searched for a central theology, a central time period, a central place, which for me was the epicenter of Christian mysticism, and I found that. And that was the deserts of Egypt outside of Alexandria between the the 3rd century primarily and the 5th century. And it really, there's a long history, and I could talk at some length about it because I'm passionate about it. Yeah. But I really believe that mysticism is not something that's outside of or somehow not central to the gospel. It is part of the core of the gospel, and the real evidence that I give for that, when people say, well, how can you make that claim, is that Jesus fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. Yeah. That to me is the central affirmation of the Gospels that lets us know, okay, Jesus was a mystic. Why? Because if you, David, or I attempted a 40-day fast, we would be hospitalized with toxemia, and we would most likely die. You have to train and build up to a 40-day fast. And so, and there's no reason not to take that 40-day fast at face value, that Jesus actually did that 40-day fast, because it appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what it tells us is, we only know about 2.5 years of Jesus' ministry. That's all that's recorded in the Gospel. Yeah. And many have speculated about what they call the lost years of those other, 32 or 33 years of Jesus' life. What was he doing? Where was he? Well, one thing is clear, and that is that he was training for a 40-day fast. And that's an ascetic kind of training. It's the training of a monk, not only a monk, but an adept monk, the equivalent, a spiritual athlete that's the equivalent of an Olympic athlete today. Yeah. So Jesus, evidenced from the 40-day fast, was a monk. He was a monastic, and he was a mystic. And of course, this comes through in shining colors in all kinds of sayings throughout the Gospels. But I always start with the 40-day fast and see that as the starting point. And then, for me, the epicenter of Christianity then went to the Egyptian desert between the 3rd and the 5th century. I mean, there was a bigger flowering of monasteries during that period. There was about 200 monasteries. and a greater flowering of monasticism and mysticism than the Christian tradition has ever known before or since. So I also think that the Apostle Mark, who founded the Coptic Church in Egypt, he went from where he was in the area around Palestine, and he went to what is now Cairo in Egypt, and he started the Coptic Church there. The Coptic Church has always been characterized by monasticism. Yeah. And I don't think that the monasteries between the 3rd and the 5th century appeared in a vacuum. I think they appeared because of the monastic apostle Mark, who brought that monasticism that he learned from Jesus to Egypt, and then eventually that flowered with 200 monasteries in the Egyptian desert between the 3rd and the 5th century. And that is where I find the theology, which for me is the core theology of Christian mysticism.
Yeah, right. And you touched on before about the lack of information about Jesus. And reading your book is one of the first times that someone has questioned that. There seemed to have been an acceptance that, you know, the Bible, the Gospels, they just talk about what we're all very familiar with, but a whole lot of things must have happened. Was this lack of information, was it deliberate, or has it just gone on over time and it's been accepted as normal by a lot of people that we don't question what was he doing all that time, and are there more records than we are aware of, or is it just a bit more difficult to find what happened in his life other than the main things that we know about?
Well, there's a well-known German scholar who is fairly reputable, who wrote a book called Jesus Lived in India, and there is some evidence that that Jesus during those lost years that we don't know about before his formal ministry appears in the Gospel, there is some evidence that he may have visited the East. And I can't say one way or another on that, and I don't think it's necessary for us to speculate on that. Yeah. But one thing that is clear, I think, is that he was he had a deep mystical life. We hear throughout the Gospels that Jesus retreated from the crowds. He prayed all night. He would go to lonely places, it says in the Gospels, to pray. So he was obviously engaged with all of the people and their concerns pressing up against him. But he also retreated on a regular basis, which to me is a balanced monasticism. It's what we might call a neo-monasticism, right, of somebody who combines the active life and the life of prayer. And I think a beautiful symmetry of that occurs in the Gospel of Luke. I believe it's in chapter 10, when the story of Mary and Martha is adjacent to the story of the Good Samaritan. So it gives us this idea, this impression that, in the story of Mary and Martha, Jesus says Mary has chosen the better part, and that is to sit in silence and gaze upon the Lord. But in the story of the Good Samaritan, it gives us a mandate to reach out to those who are suffering. And so there's this combination. And I think that is the creative tension of Jesus' entire ministry, of drawing close to God in prayer and in silent prayer on the mountains, and in lonely places, and then drawing close to people and being in solidarity with them in their struggles. So I would characterize Jesus' ministry as solitude and solidarity, a 40-day fast, and then getting into the thick of people's suffering and healing them.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you talked about the Gnostic Gospels, so really there is information out there, but it's maybe more difficult to find, but certainly, with the help of your book and others, the message is getting through that there's a growing acceptance now, a growing search for more information about him, and you're fulfilling that. And you talked about the mystics. Is it the Alexandrian mystics is sort of central, really, to your book, isn't it?
Yes.
And
yes.
The fact that
and it was. Well, there was this symmetry that happened, and really the crescendo of this symmetry was Saint Athanasius. Athanasius was an archbishop of Alexandria, and Alexandria was considered the center of theology all through the 5th century. But there were these bishops, these archbishops, who were steeped in theology and were also steeped in monastic life.
Yeah.
And they had a very deep and broad understanding of spirituality, which I found very attractive. And I think one of the sources of that breadth comes from the city of Alexandria itself. Alexandria was a port city. The great library of Alexandria that burned down was the greatest library in the world at that time. And because it was a port city, Alexandria had a number of different people coming from different parts of the world who spoke different languages. And so there was a real breadth there. And I think as a result of that, just like for me, you asked earlier, what spurred you to seek reform in the Christian tradition, and especially in the area of theology. And for me, it was growing up in different countries. I just realized that that we can't put God in a box. We can't put God in a corner. We can't pigeonhole God. We can try with our limited minds, but we won't succeed because God is ultimately a mystery with capital M. And the Alexandrian mystics knew that. Those archbishops of Alexandria between the 3rd and the 5th century. And there was a real consensus about the Jesus paradox. Now, in Greek, I'm referring to a theology that's referred to as Maya Physite, but I've translated it into English as the Jesus paradox, and that is the essence of my book. That is what the center is of the book. But there was a consensus among the Alexandrian mystics about the Jesus paradox. They all believed that this was the core of their theology, and they vehemently defended it at the Council of Chalcedon. And as a result of the vehemence of their belief in this theology, we see the first big split in the early church. And that is that the Oriental Orthodox Church split from the other churches on account of their understanding of Miaphysite, of the Jesus paradox. And people might ask, well, what's the big deal, Amos? Why the big word, and what does it matter? Well, it matters because we are so heavily scripted in the West in a dualistic understanding of the world, of winners and losers, of us and them. You referred to us and them before, and it extends to the creator with a capital C and the creature with a lowercase c, and absolute and relative, and we're so steeped in this in these binaries, in this dualistic thinking, which really is the subtle beginnings of violence. Because it's that kind of thinking that degenerates ultimately into us and them, and let's pick up guns and shoot each other. Here's just to interject a little bit of humor. I remember during the Gulf War here in the United States, I passed by a Mennonite church where a friend of mine was the minister, and he had a big sign out in front of the church, and he said, "When Jesus said, 'Love your enemies,' I don't think he meant shoot at them." But see, I mean, this is where we're going, though. Is if you start out with a more holistic understanding of who Jesus is and a more holistic mind. What Richard Rohr would call the new mind, or non-dual mind, non-dual awareness, then that leads us to nonviolence.
Right. So I think probably most people would agree that for many years there's certain entrenched sections of society who would prefer to keep things as they are and not have people like yourself rocking the boat. I mean, you rock the boat with this book. There's no doubt about it. You must have upset a lot of people.
Well, like I said, I'm a closet Quaker, and one thing the Quakers were well known for is always rocking the boat. They were such a pain in the butt that they finally got drop kicked to the New World, and there's still a few of them that linger there in England. But their idea really was radical, which is that, and they would call it that of God within you. Is that this idea of the divine light within, that all of us, and that is one of, I think, the great and profound insights of deep spiritual practice, is we come to the conclusion that each human being, and every ecosystem for that matter, has profound inherent worth and dignity. So from that standpoint, to destroy another human being or to try to destroy an ecosystem makes no sense whatsoever.
Right. And the modern day version, I suppose, of this sections of society who want to keep things as they are, and you talk about this a lot in the book, is, say, the fundamentalists and New Age people. They are quite opposed, and what, I mean, the reading I have of this book is, it's a very welcome suggestion that each side has something to what they're talking about, some significance, but the book tries to come between them and include them all, and say, they have a point in certain aspects of what they do.
Right. Well, one of the fundamental convictions of our so-called fundamentalists, they resist that term, fundamentalist, but many of the hard right, you might also call them, is that Jesus is God, period, end of story. So if you want salvation, you need to go to Jesus. If you don't go to Jesus, you're damned to hell. I mean, that's essentially what it comes down to.
Yeah.
And then the New Age Christians on the other end of the spectrum will say that Jesus was not divine with a capital D. He was another human wisdom teacher, like other founders of world religions, like Gautama the Buddha, or like Guru Nanak, who founded the Sikhs, or like Muhammad. He was a wisdom teacher who founded a world religion. And this discounts 2,000 years of witnesses who say that something unique happened with Jesus. And this is really the unique testament of Christianity among the world religions, that God came to us in human form. I mean, there are others like the Hindus who talk about avatars, and those are incarnations of deities with lowercase d. But in Christianity, we're talking about the deity with capital D came in the fullness of time to break that distance between creator and creature, and became unified with us out of love for us. And that's a powerful message, and I think that's the unique testament of the Christian tradition. So for me, I always walk the tightrope of I say, you cannot say God, Jesus is God, period, without qualifying that God in human form. You also cannot say as a believer that Jesus is human, period. If you're a believer, you have to say, if you want to be true to the 2,000 years of witnesses, you have to say that something unique happened with Jesus. That Jesus is not just a human with a lowercase h wisdom teacher like all the others. That there was so much power that flowed out of Jesus' robes and from him, that it says in the Gospels that a woman who was hemorrhaging for years just touched the hem of his garment and came away whole. But I have to be honest though here, David, is that I've been a skeptic my whole life, and I'm somebody who depends on experience to really be convicted of something. I won't just take something that's handed down to me and believe it, hook, line, and sinker, unless I have some experiential way of getting, understanding into it. And so I really didn't understand, Jesus's power until I encountered a couple of holy people who exuded that spiritual power, and I experienced that firsthand. And it was only after that I started to read the Gospels differently, and I started to realize, hey, this stuff is real. But as a Westerner, I never had a comparable experience until I met these people, one of whom I met in Delhi in India. But that made me realize, the Gospels, there's truth to this. There's validity.
Yeah, that's right. And we talked about the New Age before, and I certainly have some rapport, I'd say, with that movement. But there's something that particularly resonated with me when you spoke about the New Age not having a structure, and that's really important for me, because I wouldn't say I've been struggling with it, but I'm certainly questioning things for years. As I say, I left the church at 17 because I can't do something that I don't have my heart in. I need to know why. But certainly, New Age not having structure, that's very true, because there's so many outrageous things that come out, theories, that sort of thing, and there's no basis for them at all, yet it's okay to do that. So as you say, you're trying to work towards a balance, say, between the fundamentalists and the New Agers. They all have a point, but neither of them get it to the extent that they would maybe if they read your book and take in the things that you've said. So that has really helped me, and I hope it helps others. to question or to keep questioning what they do. And so, yeah.
Well, extremism, I think extremism is one of the big challenges we face in the 21st century. And everybody is familiar with the extremism that flies planes into buildings and that bombs abortion clinics, which is what, hardline, right-wing Christians have done in this country.
Yeah.
But we also, I don't think we're fully aware of what the detriment of New Age, where it can take us. I think eventually what the New Age does is it relativizes everything, and it says, we all have these different paths, but it's the same mountain, and so it really doesn't matter which path you choose. And there's a real kind of spiritual consumerism is what there was a Tibetan Buddhist in the United States named Chogyam Trungpa, who wrote a book called Spiritual Consumerism. And there's this I think thing in the New Age of this impulse to go into a New Age bookshop and to pick up some crystals and to get this book and to get that book and to get this kind of incense burner and to try this practice and to dabble in that practice. And it's all about, kind of a self-help project, but the real deeply rooted spirituality that has a street address and that has baggage and that has centuries of history. They just cannot deal with the baggage. They don't want any part of it, so they walk away from it. And I understand that. I really do. On a deep level, I understand that. And I was tempted to do that myself. But instead, I went and I looked for the deepest and the most life-giving aspects within my own tradition. There was another great Hindu sage, Ramakrishna, who talked about how in the New Age, people want to dig 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different wells. And meanwhile, they never really reach the water, because it's just too shallow. And what he recommended to people in the West and throughout the world is he said, stick with one tradition and keep digging and digging and digging. And you're going to get fed up. You're going to want to bail, but just keep on digging, and eventually you will find the depths and you will find water. It'll take trust. It'll take perseverance. But that's been my path. I just kept digging within the Christian tradition. I never left it. I've always been a Christian, whether it's been Quaker or Episcopal or United Church of Christ. I've always been a Christian, and I've always thirsted for those depths, and I've kept on digging.
Right. So these, we're talking about the opposites of the fundamentalists and the New Agers. They both come from very entrenched positions, and I hope that they can be persuaded to move towards something more inclusive. And I'm sure your book goes a long way towards that. But talking about the book, when was it that you first decided to write the book? Was it a long time coming?
I have to admit, David, that I started writing this book 10 years ago.
Right.
I mean, because as a minister, I don't have that much time, and it just, so I would just write piecemeal here and there. And then, one day in Montana, I gathered up all my notes and I decided, eventually this is going to become a book. I don't know when, but it took me 10 years to write. Yeah. And, I think my forthcoming books, I think my next book is going to be published in 2016 at the latest, and they'll come in a little bit shorter order. But it took me a long time because, I'm so entrenched and so heavily scripted in the Western dualistic model of us and them. So to really see beyond it, not only did I need to find the Alexandrian mystics and their teaching on the Jesus paradox, but I also had to go into a deeper place with my own practice of centering prayer. And it took me years, I think, of silent prayer and yearly retreats to really get this stuff, not just talk about it, but really start to experience non-dual awareness and the peace that comes from that.
Right. So who would you say are the main influences that have inspired you? You had the idea many years ago, but I would say that probably quite a few people have helped you on your way to get you where you are now. Anyone in particular, or a certain books or individuals that have been very helpful to you on your path?
Well, there's one teacher. I'll just refer to him as Sam. But he he is an Eastern Orthodox priest, and he encouraged me at the early stages, and he really thought that I was onto something with Maya
Right.
Physite. And he was one of these souls who just had such a deep and pervasive spirit. And whenever I met with Sam, he would always keep the focus on me and really try to draw out my deepest dreams and aspirations. And there was no self-interest at all. He was such a wonderful teacher, and if I can somehow shed even some small portion of his light, I will feel fortunate, because he encouraged me in the path of nonviolence, in the path of centering prayer, in digging into the Alexandrian mystics and really coming up with finding or rediscovering that core mystical theology of Christianity. Richard Rohr has also been a great influence, and I've read his books, and his most recent books, The Naked Now, Seeing as the Mystics See, and Immortal Diamond is another one of his most recent books. But they are, they are a wonderful testament to new mind and non-dual awareness. And so he really encouraged me with the book, and he wrote the afterword to my book. And there's a number of others. Dennis, also known as Pseudo Dionysius, who wrote the Mystical Theology and the Divine Names. That's been a very powerful influence. And then the other, probably most significant influence is Maximus the Confessor, especially his writings in the Philokalia, which is the primary mystical lineage of writings in the Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox churches. So those would be some of my primary influences, and then the Quakers remain strong. I love Howard Brinton's book, Friends for 300 Years, talking about the history of the Quakers and the nonviolent struggle. And there's there's Quaker mystics like Rufus Jones, and the list goes on. And I think if we really were to talk about one root text, I actually have a copy of it here in my hand. But this is the Unity of Christ, and this is by Cyril of Alexandria, and this particular copy is put out by Saint Vladimir Seminary Press, which is an East Orthodox press. But Cyril of Alexandria was really the champion of the Jesus paradox, or what we might call Maya Physite.
Right.
And that was really the root of then my book, Healing the Divine.
Right. So, how did you deal with actually being a writer? Because a lot of people want to be writers. I don't have that in me. And I know writers that there's just something you have or you don't. Was there something in you that needed to be developed? Did you need help to actually write? You had the thoughts, but putting them in a print so someone will publish it, that's a different story, isn't it?
Well, and honestly, David, I wouldn't call myself a writer. I would call myself a scribbler, because I'm always scribbling. I always have a notebook. I mean, anybody who's ever known me, I always have note cards in my pocket. I always have a notebook on hand. I'm always scribbling. And it's the real thing for me is I can't not scribble. I'm just always, that's how I think.
Yeah.
I mean, it helps me to think, to scribble. So I've just been scribbling for most of my life, and it's something I can't stop. And then I guess the thing that really convinced me that I was a writer is I took this online test called Strengths Finder, which is supposed to help you determine and pinpoint what your strengths are. And 3 out of my 5 strengths were all related to writing. And so it was at that point that I realized, well, I guess this is for real. And I guess these are gifts that God has given me, and it just comes naturally. It just flows. And so it's not something I've had to work at per se. It's just something that I just do innately. So
right. So you mentioned the next book as well. Was there? I'm trying to think about what. I mean, you've done the book, the first book. Is there something else that has come to you since then that inspires you to continue writing? And
Yes, and what's really inspired me is, and here again, it's rediscovering something. It's like it's like you're looking around for your keys,
Mm.
and you've looked everywhere in the house, and I've asked my wife, and I've asked my kids, and I've scurried around in the back of my car and whatnot, and then I happened to to put my hand in my coat pocket one last time, and there they are. I mean, and that's how it is. I think with this next book is that I'm looking at passages of scripture, which for me are deeply mystical,
Mm.
and Bernard McGinn, who lives in Chicago, and he's a professor, and he wrote one book called The Essential Writings of Christian Mysticism. But Bernard McGinn said, the first time that the word mysticism was coined in Christianity, it talked about things hidden in the Gospels and in the Bible. So that was the first reference points to mysticism. Is it stuff that's already there that we just overlook all the time? One case in point, which is an example of this, is Jesus says, unless the grain of wheat dies, it remains only a seed. But if it's planted and if it dies to itself, it will become something much bigger than itself, and it'll be transformed and it'll give much fruit. Now I'm ad-libbing a little bit to this text that's in the New Testament, but that's one example of many. And then there's that example in First Kings where Elijah is trying to find the voice of God, and there's this huge earthquake, and there's this huge tornado that comes through the valley, and all these special effects, and God isn't in any of that. And then there's this beautiful rendition of it in the King James Version that then Elijah heard the still small voice. Right. And when he heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle. In other words, he knew that he had come in touch with something that's at the core of all of our aspirations. Right. And which in the scientific community they might call it the voice of conscience, but it's something deep within us that has a knowing that that bypasses all of the convenient distractions of the reasoning mind, and comes to the core of who we are as people, and our meaning and our purpose in this world.
That's right. So one of the things that I occasionally struggle with is how you define something, and people may say to me, David, do you believe in God? And I can't answer that straight away, because it depends what you mean by God. Is that one of those things that really you can't question? I can't help questioning, and it's an unanswerable question. So how do you feel about that? And if someone asks you, who is God? Well, what is God?
There's this woman who because I'm on Twitter, and I have a tweeting account, and there was this woman on Twitter who sent me a tweet, and she said, Amos, I don't believe in God. So then my next question was, as I said, now tell me about the God you don't believe in. And so she started to explain this God that she doesn't believe in, and I said, I don't believe in that God either. Yeah. So a lot of it is that God is just one of those words, just like love, that it's just been pounded to death, and so it's lost all its meaning. And I there was one teacher, I forget now who it was, but said, people in the West just stopped using the word God for at least 50 years, and then use some other word instead, because there's just so much baggage around the word. Sure. And so oftentimes when somebody says, I don't believe in God, well, I don't believe in that God that they're talking about either.
Yeah, it all depends, doesn't it? I mean, I honestly can say I'm not a disbeliever. I'm certainly not an atheist. I would say closer to agnosticism. I don't really know the definition of that term, but I want to try and sort of categorize myself, and I'm open to it. I suppose some people would say I sit on the fence, but that is really where I'm at. I don't know. I don't have maybe the strength of belief that you do, but I still respect people that do, and I'm interested in talking to them like we're talking now and exchanging ideas. So that's sort of where I'm at. So let's.
But I think,
yeah.
but I think belief, so-called, reaches maturity and comes of age when it is no longer based on dogma or things that are handed down to us secondhand, but when it is experiential. And this is why I think of all the things that I advocate for, I think the thing that I'm most passionate about is the thing that has been most transformative in my own life, and that is centering prayer.
Yeah.
Now, centering prayer is something I've been doing now for 12 years, and I practice it every day. And I do one extended centering prayer retreat every year for usually 10 days. And as a result of that practice, there have been tensions in my body that I've kept in my shoulder and in my jaw and in my back. These deep-seated tensions in my body, which over these years have dissipated. And so that my body is much more loose and at ease. And when people think about, centering prayer and silent prayer or Christian meditation, they don't realize it's not just about a state of consciousness. It is about the transformation of our bodies and the healing of our nervous system. And one conversation that was an interfaith dialogue conversation that convinced me of a little bit more about this whole train of thought that I'm following now, is I talked to a massage therapist who went to Plum Village in France, to Thich Nhat Hanh's community there, and he offered to give Thich Nhat Hanh a massage. Now, Thich Nhat Hanh refused because, as a good monk, you're not supposed to be massaged by anyone. But according to this massage therapist, after he'd been in Plum Village for a few weeks, Thich Nhat Hanh finally, he said, "Oh, what the heck?" Basically, I'll let you give me a massage. Go ahead, So this massage therapist gave Thich Nhat Hanh a massage, and it blew the therapist's mind. Because he said in all of his years of being a massage therapist, which is about 20 years, he said every single person he had ever worked on always had knots in their back. They always had tensions in their body. But Thich Nhat Hanh was loose as a goose. There was not a single, ounce of tension anywhere in his body. And this just blew, the massage therapist's mind, and it made him realize on a deeper level that what we're talking about here when we talk about mysticism, it's not just a head trip, which is what the West loves. We love to go to our academic institutions and to our ivory towers and to pontificate about things. But we need. I think it was. Who was it who said? It might have been Bernard McGinn. He said, in this culture of ours, we need fewer experts and more meditators. We need fewer professors and more practitioners. Yeah. We need fewer pontificators and more people with actual depth of experience who have actually experienced the presence of God beyond names and forms and words, in the depths of their being. And then they can actually say, along with, the book of Philippians talks about a peace beyond understanding, that it's no longer, something that's mouthed or read about, but something that is experienced, even on a bodily level. So I don't know if that helps, but
it does. I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh is amazing for the person. I've actually been helped a lot by Buddhism, Buddhist teachings. I don't have a lot of time for reading a book, although that's important. But I spend a lot of time in the car, and so I'm listening to Thich Nhat Hanh, Pema Chodron, people like that, and they really have something. Those people, I don't think I've become a full-time Buddhist, but I just gained so much from them. So I'm glad you mentioned his name.
Well, and I mentioned to you, David, earlier that I've always been a Christian, but when I was in India and I decided to leave the Landar language school and I started just vagabonding around India, I came across a book by Jack Kornfield, who's a Buddhist author, and the book is called A Path with Heart. And so I read The Path with Heart, and I really resonated with it. And I thought to myself, I really need to find a deep form of meditation that is reputable and that is authentic. And I don't know where to start. Here I am in India, but I have no idea where to start. So of all things, what I did is I wrote Jack Cornfield. I wrote him a letter, a telegram from India. And lo and behold, he actually responded. And he told me, he said, one tradition that is there in India, which has very established roots, which is very reputable, is S.N. Goenka style Vipassana meditation. Right. He said, go and find yourself a Vipassana retreat center. And he told me about one in Jaipur. So I went to Jaipur and in northern India, and I took a 10-day Vipassana retreat. Now, a 10-day Vipassana retreat is, complete silence for 10 days. You're not allowed to read anything. You meditate for 8 hours a day. You're only allowed 2 meals a day, breakfast and lunch. That's it. And that is the way for a Western person to finally have a mind-blowing experience. It requires, I think, that kind of jumping into the deep end to realize that there is another world that these mystics talk about, that they're not phony, they're not full of it, that there is an authentic world of mysticism that is there, and it requires deep silences, extended silences in meditation to tap into it. One of the analogies I like to use, you might appreciate this analogy, is when I was growing up overseas, one of the things my dad loved was BBC on the shortwave radio. And it always made him feel grounded. So wherever we lived, whether it was Indonesia or Yemen or Bolivia, he always had to have BBC coming through the shortwave radio. Well, sometimes it would take him literally 15 minutes before the BBC would come through. And he would be monkeying with these antennas. There was like 4 different antennas, extremely long. And he had a series of dials, the main dials, and then there was all these refining dials. And he would finally, he would get dialed in to the short waves coming through on the BBC. And it was triumphant, and it was this like aha moment. And he just breathed easier and everything could return to normal. And he always brought his shortwave radio with him wherever we traveled, and he carried it in a case. But short waves, nobody can see them. We have no idea that they're there. No. The only reason we know that they're there is because some people have a shortwave radio and they're tuned into them, and then as a result they can receive them. And it's the same thing with this stuff that we're talking about of Christian mysticism. It is that you have to be tuned in, and you have to have spent enough time in silent prayer, and not just a little dabbling here and there. Oh, I meditated 20 minutes today. No, it's got to be deeper than that. So I'm very thankful to Buddhism, especially for Vipassana tradition in the S.N. Goenka school, for that experience. Because after that 10-day retreat in Jaipur, I actually met a Catholic priest and a Catholic nun in the lobby of the retreat center. And I said, I'm kind of surprised to see you here. And they said, oh, why are you surprised? I said, we do this retreat at least twice a year. This is a wonderful retreat. They said, this is just a method of meditation. We still read the Gospels. We still believe what we believe. But this is a method of going deeper into silent prayer. So I respected that. And I think we need that in the West.
Certainly. Meditation is very important. There are very different ways of doing it. You don't just have to sit in lotus position. For me, it's the meditative state of mind, and what gets me into that. I try to start my day listening to something spiritual and profound that sets me up for the rest of this time, which is very important to me. But in the short time we have left, I just wanted to ask you about the Church of the Painted Hills. What could you tell me about your involvement and what sort of a place is that?
Well, Church of the Painted Hills is a small church. It took me a long time to figure out that I prefer a smaller church. There's less demands on my time. The last church that I had was a much larger church, and they had demands on my time 24/7. I didn't have time to write. I didn't have time for my family. I didn't have time for centering prayer, so I didn't like it. But Church of the Painted Hills is a smaller church, and they give me more time, to have a more balanced life. Yeah. But one of the things I love about this church is the desert. I live in the desert. I look out my window and it's cactuses out there, and this is literally the desert out here, and this is called the Sonoran Desert, which is in southern Arizona. But there's something very special to me about the desert, and this particular church is nestled in the desert with saguaro cactuses all around. This desert is really growing on me. And I have to say, I think there must have been a reason why Jesus and John the Baptist retreated to the Palestinian desert. The mystics, the Alexandrian mystics in particular, went into the deserts of Egypt and then around the areas of Syria and so on. But there is something powerful about the desert. And I think I'm discovering that here at Church of the Painted Hills. There's a depth to the silence here, and there's I don't know, a stillness that you can't get away from.
It's profound, isn't it? And you really can go places within yourself when you're in a situation like that. So, is there anything else you want to share that we haven't covered yet? I'm conscious that we've only touched on the book, and I'm looking forward to soon, organising with you to go in depth. With really only I've touched a little bit, and I'm really interested to proceed with this because it's so profound, and highly recommend people who are interested in this to keep up with this. It'll go on YouTube soon. So
well, one thing that I might close with, David, is Teresa of Avila, who's one of the great mystics of the Christian tradition. She said that the greatest obstacle in prayer is the assumption that God is absent. She said of the people that she has worked with in her life, Teresa of Avila said the biggest obstacle in prayer is to pray as if God is absent. And I have to agree with that. That has been my experience in working with people, is we have such a deeply rooted culture of skepticism that people really believe that God is absent. And one of the ways that I talk about this is when my grandfather, Ed Smith, was 99 years old, I went to visit him in New York City. And at that point, when he was 99, he spoke in a whisper, and you could hardly hear what he was saying. And so I remember, really straining to hear, what he was saying, but I just couldn't make it out. So what I did is I went near his chair, and I leaned in like this, and I put my ear against his mouth. And when I really leaned in like that, I made out more of the words. Maybe 50% of the words I started to understand. And I started to actually get what my 99-year-old grandfather was trying to say. And see, the same is true for me of this stuff of Christian mysticism and Christian meditation and centering prayer, is we have to lean in and we have to not give up. We have to really have this perseverance that I'm not talking to an empty chair. That there is a presence here, that all of these witnesses in the Bible, going back to the Old Testament and First Kings, they're not all just full of it, that there is this reality that is available. But it's going to take perseverance, and we might lean into that chair for days and days and hear nothing. But eventually, I think what will happen if we persevere is that we will, and this will be an amazing thing when it happens, but we'll feel just ever so slightly like a warm breath against our cheek. And we'll realize, with more confidence than we've had before, that this stuff is real. That I am not alone, and that I am part of something much larger than myself.
Yeah.
And that to me is what it's all about. And I don't care if it's a mountaineer who's on top of a mountaintop who has that experience, who's an agnostic or however they label themselves, or whether it's somebody who's been practicing centering prayer for many years. But whatever gives you that glimpse, I think if we feed that and if we continue to try to expand on that glimpse, it's so life-giving and it's so powerful, and it can heal us on many different levels.
That's right. That's a great story, a great way of communicating that, and that resonates with me. And your story with the grandfather, thank you for that. That's really good. So Amos, unfortunately we've come to the end of our time today.
Yes.
I'm really looking forward to the next version, the next chapter, if you like, and I feel we could talk for hours, and I hope that we will.
Yes, I hope so too, David. I've had a lot of fun with this. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, so thank you very much for your time today, Amos, and I look forward to being with you again soon.
Okay, and all the best to your people there in Manchester.
Thank you, and bye for now.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.